complications later on. So can I invite the next speaker, Aditya Krishna Mutha? Is he there? He seems to be missing. So the next speaker is Sachin Kulkarni. He is also not there. The next one is Bhavik Patel. Bhavik? Okay. He'll be speaking on study of operative outcomes in epiphyseal injury based study of 30 cases.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, everybody. Today, my topic of discussion is study of operative outcome in the epiphyseal injury. John Hunter is the father of the group. Till date, there are many studies regarding the outcome of the physeal injuries, but they included both conservatively managed patients and operatively managed patients. So still the question is unanswered regarding the distribution and the effect of the certain factors like age, site of injury, and the type of fractures among the operatively managed patients. It is very well known to all of us, and I am not going to discuss it. These are the criteria depending upon which we have included and excluded the patient in our study. Minimum follow-up for each patient was 1 year, and average follow-up period was 1.75 years. All the fractures were classified according to the Salter-Harris classification, the figure depicting the same, and also classified according to the Peterson classification, and figure depicting the same, to which all of us are very well known. These are the criteria based upon which we have assessed our patients. These are the two landmark studies to which we have compared our results. The most common age group which was found in our study was 10 to 14 years of the age group, which is accounted for 46.6% of the patients, which is correlated with that of the growth spurts. And the possible reasons for this can be the increase in the size of the hypertrophic zone, which will result into the reduction in the matrix concentration in the hypertrophic zone that can lead to the weakening of the growth plate. In our study, we also found that the patient's incidence rate in the 5 to 9 years of the age group was nearer to this growth spurt, because the distal humeral physeal site was being the most common site for among the operatively managed patients, and which is more common in 5 to 9 years of the age group. Open physeal injuries are very rare, and we also found only one case in which on the final follow-up we found that some partial growth arrest leading to the angular deformity in the knee. The most common site that required the operative treatment was the distal humeral physeal site, accounted for 46.7% of the patients, followed by the distal tibia equal to distal radius, and followed by the distal femur. The most common type that required the operative treatment is Salter-Harris type 4 and the Peterson type 5, accounted for 53.3% of the patients. As a rule of thumb, these injuries should be treated as early as possible, as each day of delay resulting into the difficult reduction, and around 80% of the patients were operated on the day of the admission or on the second day of the admission in our institute. These are the based upon the pain. These are the results based upon the pain, active range of motion, and the radiological evaluation, in which 93.4% of the patients have pain-free full range of motion. Only one patient have a 20 degree of the fixed flexion deformity with further flexion possible up to 50 degree, who had a type 4 both condyle femur fracture and was operated after 7 days. Only 3 patients have a clinically visible angular deformity, whereas 90% of the patients have no clinically appreciable deformity. This is the X-ray that shows the final follow-up of that patient having an open grade 3 lateral condyle femur fracture, type 4 physeal injury. On the final follow-up, it shows the 14 degree of valgus deformity. This is our own scoring system based upon which 86.7% of the patient has excellent outcome. Only one patient has a poor outcome, who has who had a road traffic accident having a Salter-Harris type 4 both condyle femur fracture, was operated after 7 days just because of the associated head injury, and have a knee stiffness and moderate amount of the pain. Conclusion and take-home messages. The primary goal is to obtain and maintain the anatomical reduction of the physeal plate and the articular cartilage. The peak incidence of the physeal fracture is in the growth spurt period. Physeal fracture should be treated as early as possible. Type 4 Salter-Harris injury is the most common in the operatively managed patient. Most of the patients were back to their normal activity. Most common site that require the operative intervention is the distal humeral physis. Distal femoral physis is found to be a high risk physeal injury. In the high velocity trauma, angular deformity and the growth arrest are more related to the degree of initial displacement and the severity of injury. Peterson classification is better in the prognostic value than the Solters classification. Although the epiphyseal injuries are common, but the complications like the growth arrest and the angular deformity are not so common. These are the few cases. Type 4 lateral condyle humerus fracture treated on the same day with the K-wire and the excellent outcome without any abnormal deformity. This is another case having a type 3 distal tibial medial physeal injury treated with K-wire and the percutaneous screw fixation. Was mobilized after 4 weeks and implant removal was done and screw was removed after 6 months, and the patient has excellent outcome. This was the open grade 3 fracture, type 4 lateral condyle femur fracture, and on the final follow-up we can see there is no any radiolucent epiphyseal plate in the medial portion of the lateral condyle of the femur with a metaphyseal sclerosis with reduced in the height of the lateral condyle of the femur as compared to the opposite side, and increase in the space between the two screws on the medial aspect as compared to the lateral aspect, which were applied parallel in the post-operative period. That suggests the physeal arrest in the partial physeal arrest in the lateral condyle of the femur. Limitation of the studies: the less number of the patients, short duration of the follow-up, and it's not a randomized control trial. Thank you.
In this observational study of yours, what new conclusions or suggestions can you give
Overall,
to this established literature?
sir, overall the type 2 physeal fracture is most common, but it can be treated conservatively, and so among the patients who require the operative treatment, in them type 4 physeal fracture is more common. Distal femoral physeal injury is overall incidence is very rare, but in our study we found that the distal femoral physeal injury has a 20% of the incidence among the operatively managed patients, and all the 3 patients who have a distal femoral physeal injury, in one he had a knee stiffness with moderate amount of the pain. In another patient we have an angular deformity but the full range of motion, in whom we have advised hemiepiphysodesis for the same, and in another patient we have 10 degree of fixed flexion deformity with further flexion possible up to 110 degree. So the distal femoral physeal injury is means in this kind of the patient we have guard our prognosis, and we have tell to the patients about the outcome. And the distal humeral physeal injury, which is not common overall the distal radial physeal injury is most common among the patients, which has been studied by the Peterson in his book about the epiphyseal growth plate fracture. We have found the distal humeral physeal injury is most common because it is a lateral condyle humerus fracture is almost always type 4 fracture said by the Solter Hillis in his book.
Your study is consisting, as you said,
Yes, sir.
of very less number of patients, so it is difficult to make any conclusion. You need hundreds of patients to
Yes, sir.
be sure which is common and which is not. This is
Yes, sir.
an anecdotal type of study, and whatever you said are already established fact, so you are actually corroborating the established literature rather than suggesting anything new. Thanks very much.
Thank
Any
you,
other
sir.
questions?
You said distal humeral physeal injuries are very common in your studies. That's what you said.
Yes.
But for the delayed cases, when they come late, how many time, say 6 months, 2 months, about the lateral canal dropping, up to what time it should be operated?
It should be, sir, operated as early as possible because it is a fracture of sensation.
Suppose patient comes after 2 to 3 months, should we go for surgery or?
In that kind of the patient, we have to treat the deformity, which was easier to treat, because if we are going to treat at that
It should be corrected, that's my question.
up to 10 days, 10 to 15 days, we can go for the operative treatment. Otherwise, after 10 days, it has been said in the yes, sir. In any of the physeal injury, it is wise to get operate before the 10 days. Otherwise, after the 10 days, it is very difficult to get the reduction. And if we are going to for the operative reduction, then it will be more harm to the growth plate rather than the.
So the message is that do not treat epiphyseal injury very late. Right?
Yes, sir.
In case
Otherwise it will-
come to you already managed, mismanaged initially, don't try to be hero and try to go in. And similarly, don't try to do repeated manipulation.
Repeated manipulation.
Repeated manipulation in epiphyseal injury. You are unable to achieve reduction, either do open reduction or accept whatever it is, and then treat the
Deformities.
at the later stage by corrective osteotomy.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
And I now invite the next speaker, that is surgical manager, Sunil Anand. Is he there? Surgical management of teratologic and neuromuscular hip dislocation, mid-term result.
Good morning, everyone. Topic of today's presentation is surgical management of teratological and neuromuscular hip dislocation, mid-term results. Teratologic and neuromuscular hip dislocations are basically fixed dislocated hip at birth with advanced pathological changes, which means these dislocations develop in utero, so they are present at birth, and the changes are advanced just like untreated typical developmental dysplasia of the hip. This is a very rare condition, incidence being just 0.03 to 0.04 per 1,000 live births. But there is no preset diagnostic criteria. So how do we diagnose this? We have certain indicators. Commonly the clinical indicators seen are that this dislocation is present at birth. These are frequently bilateral and become irreducible at a very early stage. So we already get Ortolani's and negative Ortolani and Barlow's test. And the most important, they are associated with other severe congenital anomalies, most commonly being the arthrogryposis, others being the CP, Larsen syndrome, dystrophic dwarfism, etc. Again, radiological and orthographic indicators, they are not also diagnostic, but in general we see exaggerated changes seen in DDH. But why should we bother to differentiate TDH from DDH at all? Because TDH is resistant to treatment overall, and more so, there is no role of conservative trial in TDH. So parents can be prognosticated, surgeons should be prepared for a long frustrating treatment for repeated surgeries. We included 31 hips of 19 patients, 12 males and 7 females, 12 bilateral cases and 7 unilateral also. The mean age at operation was 32.7 months. Earliest was done was 6 months. The basic operation done was open reduction and capsulorrhaphy, but additional surgeries were required. That is, Salter's osteotomy was done in 7 of the cases, femoral shortening in 7, and adductor release in another 10. 2. Study was between 2011 and 13. We included fixed dislocated hip at birth with associated non-progressive neurological disorders like cerebral palsy or associated congenital malformations, but typical DDH cases and those patients who were more than 8 years old were excluded. Also, previously operated patients were not operated. Procedure, first step was to identify the teratological and neuromuscular hip dislocations. Then we treated the associated congenital Talipes equinovarus or congenital vertical talus or congenital dislocated knee grade 1 conservatively with serial casting. Other evaluations for the CDH were done, and orthographic evaluation was done under general anesthesia, and then decision was taken for open reduction. Open reduction was done using Smith-Peterson approach. Capsulorrhaphy was done in the best possible position. If required, femoral shortening was done if the head was found under pressure. If there was associated grade 2 or 3 CDK, that is congenital dislocated knee, then mid-diaphyseal osteotomy was done instead of a subtrochanteric osteotomy. Pelvic osteotomy was done if the head was uncovered more than 1/3, and neuromuscular dislocations were required of femoral varus derotation osteotomy with soft tissue release. Hip spica was given in all the patients for 6 weeks, which was changed under general anesthesia after another 6 weeks and continued for a total of 3 months, after which abduction brace was given. Mean follow-up was 8.7 months, during which we looked for the quality of reduction using Severin classification, the range of motion, ambulatory status, and the complications. So hip reduction was good in 22 cases, that is Severin class 1, 2 and 3. These are good prognostic cases, and was poor prognostic in 9 cases. Though range of motion increased in almost all the patients in all the planes, mostly most significantly in flexion and abduction. 9 patients could walk without support after this surgery at the final follow-up. The 7 of the patients which could not walk was because they had not started walking because of associated feet deformities or because they were too young to walk. Most common complication was subluxation, that was seen in 6 of the cases. Limb length discrepancy was seen in 1, and femur fracture was occurred in 1 of the patients, though there was no case of avascular necrosis of the femoral head. This is one of the cases which we did. Arthrography showed medial dipooling with a high ridden femoral head. Femoral osteotomy has to be done. So the conclusions that were drawn from the study: there is no role of conservative trial. The sequence of correction that can be followed if there are multiple deformities is foot correction, followed by knee correction, followed by hip. This is to allow for the hip spica to be applied, which is applied with the knee flexed. Also, after the if we go from distal to proximal, once the hip is reduced and the patient can be made to walk, and this results in early rehabilitation. Also, if there is associated CDK, we do a concomitant correction of the hip and the knee at the same setting. We found that arthrography was not very useful study because we were anyway going to open the patient's hip, so arthrography could not reveal anything more than open reduction or the direct visualization. Also, follow-up arthrography was not useful in most of the cases because capsule had contracted or there was a leak of the dye. Approach we found most effective was the anterior Smith-Peterson because it provided a good exposure and allowed Salter's osteotomy and other capsularaphy and other procedures to be done. There was it also left a very cosmetic scar, and there was minimal blood loss. Bilaterally dislocated hips, as previously suggested, should not be left. There should be a open reduction of bilaterally dislocated hips as well. And more so, we did a simultaneous open reduction of bilateral cases, which reduced complications of anesthesia and blood loss later on. Non-ambulatory patient at the final follow-up was because they were too young to walk or there was persistent knee and foot deformities. We did not encounter any of the cases of AVN, mostly because of short follow-up. So take-home message would be a better range of motion can be expected in teratologic and neuromuscular hip dislocations after open reduction. That results in greater independence in ambulation in the future, though longer follow-up is necessary to see the incidence of osteonecrosis.
Thank you very much. Any questions? So, it is clear from your talk that teratological dislocations are different and more severe than
Typical
dislocation or developmental dysplasia of it. And there is no role of conservative treatment, but even if you do surgery, then you have to do it well, and still the chances of success are not 100%.
Yes,
there are a lot of complications, short term as well as long term, like recurrent dislocation, subluxation and AVN, etc. So it's a challenging problem, and it is associated with other deformities like foot, knee, and other places. Thank you. So next speaker is Nitesh Gehlot. Is he there? The next one would be Shivana B. He will speak on flexible nail fixation versus casting method in treating shaft of femur and tibia fracture in children between the age of 16 and 14.
Good morning, everyone. My topic will be flexible nail fixation versus casting method in treating shaft of femur and tibia fractures in children of 6 to 14 years of age. So as we know, the treatment options for treating these fractures are either conservative or operative. Conservative like immediate or delayed hip spica casting in case of femur fractures, and long leg casting in tibial fractures. And operative methods are excellent fixators, compression plating, flexible intramedial nailing, and rigid intramedial nailing. The advantages of casting methods are it avoids surgery, scarring, there is no infection, bleeding, and shorter hospital stay, and it gives lesser hospital cost, and there is no refractures. And conservative operative method by flexible nailing, it gives relatively rapid fracture stabilizations, early patient mobilization, potentially it gives anatomic fracture union, and it's done with a smaller incision with a minimal blood loss, and there is no facial injury or avascular necrosis, and there is no refractures. So what we want in pediatric fracture treatment is union of the fracture, minimizing shortening, angulation rotation, minimizing soft tissue complications, minimizing social and financial cost, and getting early rehabilitations. So with this background, we have conducted a study to compare the outcome of flexible nailing and casting method for treating pediatric femoral and tibial fractures. So we have taken 50 patients, 50 patients among which 42 with a femoral shaft fracture and 8 patients with a tibial shaft fractures with an average of 10.08 years for a flexible nailing, and 30 patients with femoral shaft fractures and 12 with tibial shaft fractures at an average of 9.53 years of age for casting method. And we have followed it up for more than 1 year, and most cases were middle third, simple, minimally comminuted, and most were transverse fractures. All fractures were reduced with closed method, and flexible nailing done with 2 elastic nails, either titanium elastic nails or Enders nail, depending upon the availability. No additional immobilization was given, and implants were routinely removed after bone union. For casting method, we have reduced closed method, and we have given early spica casting, and those who had shortening of more than 2 cm in initial x-rays, we have given initial traction and then applied for and considered for delayed spica casting. We evaluated through hospital stay, limb length discrepancy, malalignment, range of motion, and complications, and analyzed through Flint's 10 outcoming scoring, ranging from excellent results to poor results. What we got is flexible nail had a little higher hospital stay than casting group, and those who treated with flexible nailing, most of 90% of them walked with full weight bearing in less than 8 weeks, but casting took more than 12 weeks. 17% of the casting group had more than 2 cm of shortening due to angulations and overriding, and more 60% of them had angular deformity, and 1 case with external rotation of more than 10 degrees, which was not acceptable. And those who treated with flexible nails gained complete range of motion in 7.7 weeks, and those who treated with casting method gained 11.28 weeks. We have noticed 2 cases of soft tissue inflammation in patients with treated with the flexible nailing, and there was no soft tissue complication in casting method. So overall, the flexible nail gave satisfactory to excellent results, but casting, those who treated with the casting method resulted in 2 poor results. Summarizing that, flexible intramedullary nailing gives short hospital stay relatively, and there is no deformities, gaining early range of motion, and children can go to early to school. But casting method, though there was a short hospital stay, but there was a higher rate of deformities and complications. So the ideal device should be device in treating pediatric shaft fractures in femur and tibia are. It should be simple load sharing internal splint. It should allow mobilizations. It should maintain alignment and assist in rapid healing, giving micro motions at the fracture site, and it should not disturb a growth plate or blood supply to the femoral head, which is excellently given by flexible nails. Casting, though, there are many advantages, but it has got disadvantages too, including increasing the social cost and hygiene, maintaining difficulty in maintaining hygiene of the child. This is one example where a 12-year boy had a fracture in the junction of the middle and the lower third, reduced with a good alignment, but after 6 weeks it went into varus deformity. And we can come across complications like extensive skin necrosis and compartment syndrome of the leg. Selecting the correct patient for flexible nailing and using exact biomechanics of the diaphyseal stability, following 3-point fixation, we can achieve flexural stability, translation stability, axial stability, and rotational stability of the shaft fractures. And this is one example where, with the following a correct technique, we have gained, we have got a good alignment and good fracture union. This is another example, 6-year boy with femoral shaft fractures treated with Enders nails. We have gained a good result. So only complication is the pain at the insertion site noted in patients treated with the flexible nails. So my conclusion will be flexible nails are better than casting method in treating children with femoral and tibial shaft fractures and in an age group of 6 to 14 years. So we recommend flexible intramedullary nailing for these fractures. Thank you.
Thank you very much. How did you choose your patient for casting or mending? Did you offer everyone nailing choice and those who did not want wait for plaster or what?
No, sir. This is depending on the affordability of the patient, and we have recruited patients from previous hospital records also for those who are treated. Nailing, we have done prospective study, and some of the patients recruited from hospital records, those who are treated with the casting previously.
Any questions?
The problem arises in distal third fracture where you have tibia or femur.
Yes, sir.
When you go for 3-point
So-
direction. So what happens, nails they cross each other, then again they become straight post fracture. How do you control that?
Sir, actually, the extreme distal fractures and extreme proximal fractures were excluded from our study, and
In one of your tibia, it happened like that.
so.
Tibia fractures, they crossed earlier the fractures, and then ideally they should be at convex the fracture site.
So that what he is
That-
trying to say that it is a suitable technique for diaphyseal fracture, not for metaphyseal fracture at either end.
So diaphyseal, distal third, so 1/3.
Yes, sir. If you follow the 3-point fixation exactly, that you can still you can reduce the fracture correctly, and you can get a good union.
Quickly, I have two more questions.
But-
Abhishek, please.
What was the average hospital stay for a nailing patient?
Average 8.36 days in nailing patients, and we have got 5.36 in casting method.
You said that casting patients longer stay.
No. I said we have got.
But why do you keep nailing patient for 8 days?
Sir, that's depend like we like in government setup. Like most of the patients were BPL, so we had a difficulty in getting implants from government setup, sir. So
they are staying more pre-operatively than post-operatively.
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Same question.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Now, the next speaker is Rohit. Is he there? He'll speak on management of diaphyseal forearm fracture in pediatric age, similarly treated by elastic nails.
Good morning, everyone. Today I'll be speaking about treatment of pediatric forearm fractures with elastic nailing. This study was done in Adi Chunchanagiri Institute of Medical Sciences, that's in Bellur, Karnataka. It's a rural hospital. Coming to the introduction, world-renowned orthopedist Dr. Willis C. Campbell stated that when the satisfactory alignment in the fractures of both bone forearm in children is not possible by conservative means, then surgical correction is required, especially in oblique and spiral fractures. So internal fixation is needed to prevent the bowing. As the acceleration of the life has been upbeat in the younger generation these days, the fractures of forearm of both bone in children have become a common day-to-day practice of orthopedicians. The treatment of the diaphyseal fractures in the children are a significant challenge to the surgeons. The treating options are conservative methods to surgical methods. Conservatively, you can try close reduction and casting. Surgically, close reduction internal fixation with elastic nailing, or open reduction with internal fixation with plate-in screws. Each of these proposed methods has its limitations. The conservative method poses problems like deformity, loss of motion, loss of reduction, non-union and malunion. But with the recent advancement and development in the field of surgical interventions, surgical experience has improved, and improved rehabilitation techniques has put the surgical technique on the upper hand. The methods are 20 patients with diaphyseal fractures of forearm in children were treated in Adi Chunchanagiri Hospital. They were treated with elastic nailing. The study was done in both male and female patients. The age between 5 to 15 years, and only the diaphyseal fractures were included. The indications being 16 patients had instability post conservative management, and 4 patients had redisplacement after the conservative management. Other inclusion criteria of the included patients were the simple transverse fractures, oblique fractures, comminuted fractures, and segmental. And exclusion, compound fractures, pathological fractures, refractures, and malunited fractures were excluded from the study. A careful history was elicited from the patient or the patient's attendants. Careful clinical examination for skeletal and soft tissue was done. Then clinical examination gives a clue to determine whether the fracture was caused by direct or indirect force. The examination was done to rule out any other fractures. Then vital signs, and the diagnosis was confirmed by taking AP and lateral views. Close reduction was tried under conservative method. The fractures which failed to reduce or which failed to maintain the reduction were immobilized in above elbow slab until the surgery, and analgesics were given to relieve the pain. Close reductions of the fracture were done under general anesthesia under CIAM guidance. When the satisfactory reduction is not achieved surgically, then surgical intervention is mandated. The acceptable deformities, as given by well-renowned pediatric orthopedician Price CT, in the fractures at any level in children less than 9 years of age, complete displacement, 15 degrees of angulation, 45 degrees of malrotation are acceptable. And in children over the 9 years of age, 30 degree of malrotation is acceptable with 10 degree of angulation for proximal fractures and 15 degrees for distal fractures. Complete bent apposition is acceptable, especially for distal radius fractures, as long as the angulation does not exceed 20 degree and 2 years of growth remains in the patient. This is the study from Price et al. Then Daruwala also did a study on the radioulnar movements following forearm fractures in children. He has stated that angulatory deformity of more than 10 degree in a child above the age of 10 failed to remodel adequately with growth, particularly if the fractures in the proximal half of the forearm and rotation alignment also was not able to be corrected with growth. All the surgeries were done within 3 to 7 days of the injury under general anesthesia under aseptic precautions. Antibiotic treatment was given appropriately. Active finger and shoulder movements were encouraged immediately on post-op day 1. Post-op day 1 to allow the reduction of the edema and also to promote better circulation. Post-operative radiographs were taken on next day, and suture removal was done on 10 days post-op, and patient was discharged. Actually, we have discharged patients, some of the patients were discharged more early, and they were later called up for suture removal and cast conversion. Review of the patient was done for 12 months with 5 visits. On 3rd week, 6th week, 3rd month, 6th month, and 12th month, radiox X-rays were taken on appropriate interval to look at the callus formation. After 2nd week, the POP or slab was applied after confirmation of the complete healing of surgical wound and suture removal. After 4 to 6 weeks, the POP was removed and radiographs were repeated. After confirmation of fracture union, clinically and radiologically, patient was encouraged for joint motion at the elbow. Improvements in the range of movements were noted on every week visit. The elastic nail, that is the TENS, titanium elastic nail, can be introduced proximally or distally in the ulna, whereas distally in the radius. Antegrade entry point in the ulna can either be the posterior aspect of olecranon apophysis or lateral approach to proximal metaphysis. The retrograde entry point in the ulna is through the distal metaphysis. The pins are placed directly through the tip of olecranon apophysis have strong tendency to cause bursitis and pain until removal. So initially when we started our study, we were doing that entry from the tip, but later we have changed it to the proximal metaphysis lateral entry. Open the cortex with awl because it tends to wander less than the motorized drill, and it allows ulnar entry with little or no formal insertion. The radius is approached distally, just proximal to the distal physis with protection of the superficial radial nerve. Or an alternate technique into the radius entry is through the Lister's tubercle dorsally. A 45-degree oblique hole is drilled in the lateral cortex of the metaphysis to allow the nail insertion. The nails have to be anchored in the upper and lower metaphyseal portions of the bone, and the summit of the curve must be calculated preoperatively to lie at the level of the fracture to produce an internal 3-point fixation construct. The post-op protocol was patient was immobilized in above elbow call and removed surgically. It's removed, the above elbow cast is removed. Patient is followed up regularly on 3rd week and 6th week, and we followed up till 12th week till we see radiological union. The results, the time of union, most of the fractures united, around 85% united in 10 to 12 weeks, and we had some complications. 75% of the people were uncomplicated, 20% had a superficial infection, and one patient had refracture. Actually, that was post-implant removal. He had a self fall, and the functional outcome was graded based on Price et al. Criteria. Excellent in 85% patients, good in 10%, and fair in 5%. There were no poor results. These are the criteria used, Price et al. Criteria. These are the cases. This is a pre-op APN lateral and post-reduction. Yes, sir. Yes. And post-reduction, reduction not satisfactory, so he was operated. And these are the follow-up range of movements and X-ray photos. The time of union, most of the fractures were united within 12 to 14 weeks. We had 100% union. In complications, we had 4 patients with superficial infection and 1 patient with refracture. Functional results, we had 75% excellent, 15% good, and fair and 10%. No poor results. Conclusion, the advantages of elastic nailing of pediatric forearm fractures is that it facilitates biological fixation of the fractures and promotes early union. Biomechanically, they have shown to act as internal splint and provides the nail to extend 3 or more diameters beyond the fracture site. The nails have to be anchored in the upper and lower epiphyses of the bone, metaphyseal portions. The summit of the curves should be calculated preoperatively and lay at the level of the fracture to produce internal fixation construct. Use of physis sparing entry points of radius and ulna preserves the natural curves and contouring of the nails recommended, with particular attention to restoring the appropriate radial bow, which prevents the complications and also maintains the stability of distal radial ulnar joint. We preferred immobilization in slab in our patients because at the end of 3 weeks, we were able to mobilize the patients at below elbow in the slab only. Our study was found to be satisfactory, and hence we recommend elastic nailing for diaphyseal fracture of children where the close reduction and casting fails. And thank you.
Any questions? It seems there is now a trend to operate more and more in pediatric age group also, right, in elastic nail, but I have 2 reservations. One is the entry point. It is not always so easy to find a point away from the epiphyseal growth plate. And
Yes.
I have seen patients having epiphyseal growth damage because of bad entry point.
Yes.
Second is issue of removal. How many people have tried removing these nails? Sometimes there is a lot of bone formation and you actually have to damage a lot of bone to dig those nails out.
Yes, sir. For that, while taking the entry point, we usually use a CM guided. So we have not seen any fascial damages in our study. And for removal of the implant, what we do is we don't completely bury the implants in the bone. We just leave 3 to 5 mm of the nail outside, so that it will be easier for us to remove. And we have removed most of the implants by 6 weeks, so we have not encountered any such difficulties.
Great, thanks. The last paper in this session is by Ankit Chawla. He will be speaking on tibial positioning of ACL.
Good morning. The topic of my study was tibial position of anterior cruciate ligament, an MRI-based morphometric study in Indian patients. The anterior cruciate ligament attaches from the medial surface of the lateral femoral condyle and runs distally to attach to the tibial spine in the intercondylar fossa. The 2 main biomechanical functions are it retains anterior translation of tibia and control medial rotation of tibia on the femur. Following ACL reconstruction, in more than 90% cases, we have obtained good to excellent results. There might be a 5 to 10% failure rate, which patients require revision surgeries. The causes of ACL graft failure may be a traumatic graft rupture or a graft attenuation or a failure of graft incorporation. While the technical error, tunnel position, has been implicated as a cause of graft failure. Technical error has been implicated as the most recognized cause, and the most important technical error is tunnel misplacement. Hence, the knowledge of normal ACL anatomy is very crucial. Various anatomical studies have said that anatomical ACL reconstruction is significantly better than non-anatomical ACL reconstruction in terms of improved knee kinematics, stability, and final outcome. The aim of my study was to assess the anatomical tibial insertion of native ACL in relation to proximal tibial width to obtain a baseline data in Indian patients, and to we measured the position of tibial insertion on ACL in relation to proximal tibial width using MRI, and we also measured the maximum anterior, posterior, and medial lateral dimension of ACL tibial footprint. Knee MRI of 55 patients was prospectively obtained of both sex with a mean age of 36 years. The patients with evidence of advanced osteoarthritis, intra-articular fracture, ACL pathology or prior surgery on the knee joint were excluded from the study. All the MRI images were acquired on a 3 Tesla machine with a standardized knee protocol, and the 3 mm thick slices with 0.5 mm interslice gap were obtained. The images were analyzed using the software Osirix, and all the measurements were made by 2 independent blinded observers. The measurements recorded were the total anteroposterior diameter of the tibia, the anterior most position of the ACL insertion, the posterior most position of the ACL insertion, and the AP width, that is CD, of the ACL tibial footprint. This was in the sagittal plane. Same in the coronal plane, we measured the total medial lateral diameter of the tibia, medial most position of ACL insertion, medial and medial lateral width of the ACL tibial footprint. These are the few cases demonstrating the measurement, a sagittal image and a coronal image. The following results were obtained, overall or male or female. Since these results are all in mm, an interior limit, posterior, from the sagittal center, medial, lateral and coronal center. All these measurements were expressed as the percentage of tibial width in order to standardize the results regardless of the patient size or sex. See, the following results were obtained. For the anterior, there was no significant difference found in male and females, and the tibial insertion was located between 29.2 and 60.7 of the total depth of tibia in the AP plane. And it was determined that ACL takes up to average 31.3% of the total sagittal depth of tibia. In the coronal plane, again, medial and a center and a lateral position was determined. No significant difference was found in male and females, and tibial insertion was located between 40.1 to 58.9 of total width of tibia. ACL takes up to average 18.8% of the total coronal width of the tibia. The length of the ACL tibial footprint in the sagittal plane was measured to be of average 14.57 mm, and there was a male-female difference which was statistically significant. Again, in coronal plane, the average of ACL tibial footprint was 13.3 mm, and male and female difference was statistically significant. Inter-observer for reliability, intra-class correlation coefficient of more than 0.8 was calculated. So the incorrect tunnel positioning during ACL reconstruction, as I said, is a frequent cause of ACL reconstruction, ACL failure. It often stems from non-anatomic placement of the ACL graft. A 2 interior graft would result in roof impingement. A 2 posterior would lead in a vertically placed graft. 2 medial loss of flexion, and a 2 lateral graft would lead to graft impingement. Thus, the knowledge of ACL anatomy is crucial to the success of surgery, especially with regard to tibial and femoral footprints. Based on our findings of the study, it was determined that ACL takes up to 31.3 of the total sagittal width and 18.8% of the total coronal width, and the tibial insertion of the ACL is located between 29 to 61% of the total depth of tibia in AP dimension, and the tibial insertion is located between 40 to 59% of the total width of the tibia in medial lateral dimension. MRI is typically obtained on most primary and revision patients to determine the status of the existing graft and evaluate for any coexistent pathology. Thus, MRI is a clinically relevant modality in evaluating failed ACL reconstruction as well. So, with established values for pre-op norms, MRI can be used to assess the reconstructed ACL graft position in relation to its normal location based on the width of the proximal tibia. The study has described the ACL tibial footprint quantitatively in terms of measurement and its position of tibia in Indian patients, and the results of studies are in accordance with the previous studies in the literature. And this information may be used as a guide to evaluate patients after primary ACL reconstruction or a prior to revision ACL surgery, or in ACL reconstructed patients with pain, instability and dysfunction post-operatively. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
Nice study, doctor. Do you want to extrapolate your inference of your study to reconstruct the ACL in the form of more collagen inside or double bundle? Because your footprint is coming somewhere near 15 mm on the tibial side.
Yes, sir. The footprint in the sagittal plane has come out to be about 14.57 mm. And it has been suggested in various studies that in patients more than 14 mm, by Freddy Fu, it's been suggested that then ACL double bundle reconstruction can be suggested in those patients. Double bundle ACL reconstruction.
So any comments from you?
I didn't understand.
Yeah, I want more clarification in the sense that did you consider the patient height in your study?
No, that's what. We took patients all again, as I said, that we took the patients, we did not consider the height of the patient, but to standardize the result, we divided the position of the ACL by the total ACL of the width. We divided the measurement of the ACL position and the ACL width with the proximal tibia width. So that was done to standardize the results. When it was seen without this standardization, there was significant difference between male and female patients in terms of position, in terms of size of the ACL. But once we divided and took it as a percentage, the position of the ACL, there was no statistical difference between the patients. So the height was not considered. And
I think you can give more clarification to him also.
okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
We are running very late, so I have to conclude now. Thank you.
Session. Is Dr. Palash Gupta here? There is likely the program Dr. Ram Prabhu will be presenting his paper first. We all know in the stalwart field of orthopedics, and especially in JES, and it's an honor to listen to him. Dr. Ram, please.
Thank you, Chairman, sir. Good morning, friends. He said specialist in JACE, but the thing is that in my trauma practice, it's about 5% of the cases which really are complicated, open fractures, etc. we manage with JACE. It's not that it's the only way that we manage. And this lecture of mine is just to sort of highlight a couple of things that we have been doing for intra-articular fractures, the lower end of the humerus, by this method. Now most of you probably would be knowing about JACE, but for those I will just, who do not know, I would just go through it quickly. The time is little short, but I have a couple of videos also. So Chairman sir, if you can help me with the time. A couple of things that you need to really know about the anatomy before you actually embark on doing the lower end of the humerus fractures is you got to know the anatomy of this lower end very well, and then you need to know that it's a tie arch. The lateral column is attached to the capitulum, and the medial column ends on the medial side, which is non-articular end, which is very important to know, because when you are reconstructing many pieces, this needs to be actually remembered. You also need to know that there is a carrying angle of about 4 to 8% degrees, and that needs to be restored again, so that you need to have a complete range of motion. And if you do not restore this properly, probably some amount of flexion or extension is likely to be hampered. And this is also very important, that the condyles or the articular part of the humerus is approximately 40 degrees to 50 degrees in front. So this also needs to be reconstructed. In case if you reduce that angle, then you will automatically reduce that kind of flexion, and if this angle is increased when you are reconstructing, you will lose that amount of extension, and this needs to be remembered also. And there are these fossas which also have to be remembered when you are putting some screws or K-wires through that. In case if you impale them like this, then obviously you are going to have restriction of motion. You also need to know a proper anatomy on the X-rays on the AP and lateral, and it's always better and nice to have a normal elbow X-ray on the viewing box when you are doing this, because when you are taking a C-arm picture, then you would probably compare it with this C-arm picture with the viewing box, and then you will be able to know the reconstruction, which is good. A simple technique of traction will give you or help you to evaluate this kind of very difficult fracture into a proper pathoanatomy which could be recognized. You don't have to take a 3D CT scan, which is expensive in our patients, poor patients. You know the mechanism of injury when you get a lower end of fractures, and this is what is the simple frame that we reconstruct in 3 or 4 part fracture of the lower end of the humerus. It may be C3 fracture. In this we have 3 parallel wires. The first wire, which is important, makes this 3-part fracture into 2-part fracture. So this we have a medial to lateral fixation, which these K wires are about 2.5 to 3 millimeter in diameter. They are pointed, trocar pointed, and this is how we go. We have to take care of the ulnar nerve on the medial side. So if you are a little scared of this, you can take half a centimeter incision there to actually find out the ulnar nerve and see that it remains the harm's way. These two KVARs are little proximal. You don't have to be worried about the radial or the ulnar nerve because it goes little posterior to the oval of the arm. And these two KVARs fix the distal part to the proximal KVAR, and this not only holds this well, at the same time prevents the translation of these KVARs on side to side. So this is very important. So basically these are 5 KVARs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 KVARs, and the side connecting rods which help. Many times you have come across a very complicated complex fractures in which you can't really put a plate or a screw. So in those cases, to just tide over the crisis, you put KVARs. Now these KVARs, once you start mobilizing the humerus lower end, it backs out, many times comes in the hand. So these same KVARs are fixed outside with the external connecting rod, and this is important. These are some operative steps. This is just to demonstrate how this is done. In fact, we do not take this kind of incision. Many times, almost about 30 to 40% of the cases, we do it close manipulative reduction and KVARs. So this is how a Campbell's tongue shape incision is taken. This is how the fracture which is there has been aligned well. This is the olecranon fossa. Most of the times nowadays we do not actually do olecranon osteotomy. We hold this with a towel clip, and that is how we just pull it up. That distraction is good enough to get this. So this is how the towel clip distracts. We get the fractures together, and then we start passing those KVARs in different directions. This is how we pass. First the medial side, from medial to lateral, then these two oblique KVARs, and then after doing this, we put these two KVARs on the transverse, either from the medial or lateral side, taking care that we take a stab incision, go on the bone and pass this with a low rotation mechanized drill. And this is how we finish off this thing, and this is how on the table we see the mobility and stability. This is the fracture which is been there, olecranon fossa, fracture has been aligned, and you see the complete range of motion. This is how we do. This is for the demonstration, but we will not take such a big incision most of the times. And then we close this wound. And this is the fracture which was operated. This is old osteoporotic fracture, and this is how it was fixed. This is the lady. We started mobilization immediately, and at the end of it she had a reasonable good functional range of motion. And this is very important for osteoporotic fractures that we see. Now this is a grade 3 compound fracture in this C3 fracture. This is how this was fixed. There was a small mini incision to align those, and this was a big wound which had to be skin grafted later on. So this is how we fixed it. This is how the skin graft was done, and this is how the fracture united in about 10 to 12 weeks. This is how his full motion, painless, complete functional range of motion in a badly comminuted compound fractures. So this is how it helps, especially in open fractures and open injuries. Similarly, type 4 fracture here, in this case we had done an olecranon osteotomy in the initial stages, and this is how we start the range of motion exercises immediately post-operatively on the second or third day. This is how second case, which again olecranon osteotomy, this is how the incision was done to get those fractures aligned. And this was in couple of cases when there is a fracture of capitulum, we go little anterolateral, put an extra KVAR which needs to be put sometimes, especially if you can't have a fixation properly. And this is how we do in about 30 to 40% cases where we have a fracture which is comminuted, osteoporotic bones again, and this is how we can get an alignment well. Many times we can actually modify this frame if need be, reducing the number of KVAR. So this is how no incision, and this is how we start the exercises immediately within, and in 4 weeks we had a reasonable good range of motion. And this patient, I can assure you that this patient will have practically full range of motion with this kind of method. So this is a minimally invasive technique and which is extremely helpful. Again, side sap injury, this patient had elbow injury with with ulna fracture which was comminuted, and this is how it was open fracture. Both these things were fixed with Jay's fixator, and this is how we also did some skin grafting here, and this is how the patient started mobilizing. And this is an interesting case of a 9-year-old girl who had a pathological fracture of the lower end of the humerus. She was operated twice to to get this thing fixed. There was a cyst which had to be bone grafted. They had put some bone grafts before, but this had gone into non-unions. All the movements were occurring at the non-union site. The elbow was absolutely stiff, and this is how we could actually move this forearm 360 degrees. And these are the pseudo movements occurring at the fracture site. And this again we put a similar kind of J's. Of course, we used thinner K wires, 1.5 millimeter thickness K wires. And what we had is that we did not have a bone graft donor site, so we had put a calcium hydroxyapatite crystals. And this is how within about 12 weeks this united. And now you can see on the C arm that the fracture movements are not there. The elbow movements you can see good range of motion, and this is how we can see that there is a painless good range of motion. This patient followed up about 2 years after the surgery, and now till now she has good range of motion and she is doing well. Now she is about 11.5 years old. So this technique is applicable to most of the different types of comminuted complex fractures, and also same surgical approach, same frame could be used in most of the times. The time which is required is most of the times less, because if you can do close manipulated reduction can be done. You need to have 5 K wires, some 16 link joints and 4 connecting rods. Extremely versatile. You can actually adjust this frame later on if you want to, and the technique is extremely simple, very, very cost effective, and can tide over crisis in many of the cases where you have problem and complex things. The chances of infection are minimal. Of course, you need to take chances, certain precautions. The techniques can be applied in osteoporotic bones. In fact, we have found that this is extremely useful in osteoporotic bones, and the cost of the whole frame is not more than 1,500. So, in the end, the message is treatment of each fracture must be individualized. Rigid recommendation of these frames cannot be actually told, but this is the basic standardized frame which we can actually modify. You need to our answer to complex fractures, open fractures of the lower end of the humerus, and in osteoporosis is J's. Thank you very much, friends. Can I have the questions now so that yeah.
Any questions?
Yeah, it's not exact time, but it's around, it takes about 10 to 12 weeks. We need to keep this for about 2 to 3 months, this K wires, but the patient is allowed to move. He can actually do his activities of daily living, and once X-ray radiologically it is good, we remove the K wires. Other thing is that just if you are a little skeptical about the union, what we do is remove this or loosen these link joints, see clinically if it is strong enough, and then we remove the K wires. No, in fact, see, what I didn't tell you was we do not use any shank screws. We used to use for almost 10 years shank screws in most of the JS frames, but we realized the chances of infection and pin tract infection and loosening is much more in shank screws than threaded K wires. So we use smooth K wires, which is the basic principle of Elizarov, and we pre-stress them when we tighten those with the connecting rod. So once we do that, the chance of pin loosening is minimal. I won't say 100% no, but absolutely minimized. That is not a problem at all.
Any evidence of radial nerve injury during penetration of the K wire?
No. What we do is just to, as a precaution, we always take a stab incision about 2 millimeter, pass a hemostat, open it out. Once you open out, you actually come to the humerus, and under either you can put a guide sleeve guide, or you can actually under that hemostat you can pass a K wire. And we haven't had any radial or median nerve palsy. We have done more than about 110 cases. Other thing is that we have had some cases of ulnar neuritis, transient ulnar neuritis, because we had not actually identified the ulnar nerve, but we have never penetrated a nerve.
And how percentage of pin tract infection?
See, as I told you, in fact, this patient, after 2 days we do some dressing, because if you have opened the fracture, and after that we straight away call the patient after 3 weeks. If we take precautions of going slow with the mechanized drill and don't go very fast, the chances of thermal necrosis is minimal. See, what are the reasons for infection is that if there is a nidus which is formed by the infection, and if we do not actually stabilize the thing. See, AO fixators were rigid, and if you actually take care of the AO fixators also, they do not give any infection. In fact, people have kept the Elizara and this thing for six months. So the chances of infection are minimal if you take some precautions that there is no thermal necrosis. Don't go on the skin directly and go with a big RPM. Less than 300, 400 RPM is always better. Go very slowly so that the chances of thermal necrosis are minimum. Yeah, that's what we've done. In fact, I told you 30 to 40% of the ulna, if you have to do close, put it in extension and do it. Just like how you put supracondylar K wires, so that the ulnar nerve goes behind. No, you can open, I said. I don't open in all the cases. But if you are scared of the ulnar nerve, then you just make a small incision so that you can actually feel the ulnar nerve, put it behind with the hemostat and pass K wire. No, so what we do is put elbow in extension so that the ulnar nerve remains behind and you go in front. Ulnar nerve will be always behind. It's similar when we have a supracondylar fractures in children. We pass the K wires on the medial side with the extension. Open. We don't open. If you want. I said that if you are scared of the ulnar nerve impalement, you can always open it.